It's an incredibly long flight, and the King is actually en route as we speak. He was spotted arriving at Heathrow Airport for a commercial flight, actually. It's understood he perhaps is going as far as Singapore before joining up with the Queen, who's been on a private break, and then they'll make their way together to Sydney. But when they do touch down in Sydney later on today, it's actually going to be, here's a bit of trivia for you, the first time ever a reigning king has stepped foot on Australian soil, because it was the late Queen who visited as the first reigning monarch way back in 1954. A year after her coronation, and funnily enough, it's a year after King Charles's coronation, and he's visiting today. But of course, there was a huge question mark whether or not this visit could take place at all because of his cancer diagnosis. It's a 6-day trip, so relatively short, and there has been perhaps some concessions made. For example, New Zealand was originally on the cards for the King and Queen to visit. That no longer happening. He's only visiting New South Wales, which is Sydney and Canberra, so he's not going to be visiting like his late mother did every state and every capital city around the country apart from Darwin back in 1954. But of course we have to remember that the King is 75 years old. When the late Queen first visited Sydney as monarch, she was 27 years old. But there are going to be some disappointed racegoers as well, because the King is having a rest day tomorrow, partly because of his cancer diagnosis and perhaps because it's an incredibly long flight as well. So there's King Charles III Stakes happening at the Randwick Racecourse, and there was some speculation as to whether the King and Queen would attend tomorrow. I understand that is not happening, but certain engagements have been added. For example, the King is meeting 2 cancer experts here in the country. Australians of the Year, they have been dubbed, and they have done a lot of work tackling melanoma, a form of skin cancer, which is one of the most common forms of cancer in Australia. But what do the people here think about the King and Queen's upcoming visit? Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask Republicans, funnily enough, they are dubbing it the farewell tour of Oz. Graham Smith, campaigner, he has flown all the way out here to Sydney, and he's planning to protest in Australia. He's planning to protest in Sydney and indeed Canberra with those big yellow signs. But perhaps more significantly is 6 state premiers, 6 leaders, political leaders, have all snubbed an official reception with King Charles and Queen Camilla in Canberra on Monday. There's been various excuses from cabinet meetings to trade envoy visits, but monarchists are pointing out that this trip has been in the diary for months and they couldn't spare half a day to come for a reception. But Republicans saying that clearly it would be a huge cost to the taxpayer for these premiers to fly to the capital city of Australia to attend just a single reception. So make of that what you will. Monarchists calling it a bit of a slap in the face. But I spoke to a couple of Australian people earlier on today, and here is what they said.
So excited about it.
Are you?
Yes. We actually saw him when we were in, where was that?
Oh, in Windsor.
In Windsor.
Not really interested.
You're not really interested in the King coming?
No. I believe Australia should become a republic.
Australians are going to welcome Charles and Camilla down under?
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? Yeah, we're friendly people.
Sort of happy to see them. I'm glad they're coming out. It's good that they're showing some support for the country. It's kind of cool. Something to read about in the news, I guess.
I think everybody's just doing their thing and we should let them. I think it's all good. We welcome pretty much everybody here.
Well, speaking of welcoming King Charles and Queen Camilla, the Australian Monarchist League say they wrote a letter to King Charles ahead of the visit where several thousand signatures were on it welcoming the monarch to the country. And they say the point of their organisation is to defend the Constitution and the Crown in Australia because it best protects the freedoms and democracy of the Australian people. Well, following King Charles and Queen Camilla landing in Australia, the Sydney Opera House, that world-famous landmark, is going to be lit up with projections of images of King Charles's 15 previous visits to the country, official previous visits to the country.
Just going to cut live to Australia. This is the plane carrying King Charles and Queen Camilla, who have just touched down in Sydney. Our man Cameron Walker is on the ground. Not sure if we've got him, but this is the jet that's arrived from Great Britain. A pretty long flight, Nana, actually.
It's about a day, isn't it? You arrive a day behind, a day ahead of the day you've left. So it's like, I'm having this day again.
Groundhog Day.
Deja vu.
But the doctors have, of course, given the King the green light to travel to Australia in light of his cancer diagnosis and recovery. So it's going to be an epic 6-day trip. I think they're then going... where are they going afterwards?
Well, on the 21st, they had that invite for the premiers across Australia, which a lot of people have declined. In fact, all of them declined.
Yeah.
So I think that it will be mainly them talking to those who are sort of amenable to the royal family, because it seems that after all that stuff with Meghan and Harry, I'm not blaming them entirely, but I think that has cast a spanner in the works, and a lot of people sort of starting to look negatively towards the Commonwealth, which is sad.
Yeah, and of course in January, Australia scrapped a planned referendum on the monarchy. PM Anthony Albanese said that they may do it again later next year or perhaps in a couple of years, but they said in anticipation of this very trip where the King and Queen are arriving now in Australia, they would hold that referendum on being part of the Commonwealth until a couple of years' time. Who's that through the window there?
You never know.
If you're listening on radio, we've got a zoomed-in shot of the jet, and Cameron Walker's there now. Cameron, I hope you're a bit drier. This is the dramatic landing of the King and Queen. How's it going?
I can't hear him. All I can hear is... Cam... Right, so, well, listen, so obviously Cameron Walker is there. We will get a live from Cameron as soon as we can. But what we've got here is a plane. We've gone right and zoomed into the windows to see if we can see some faces of who that might be on the plane. I mean, I doubt they're sitting there in their seats. They're probably moving on. Right, let's see if we can get hold of Cameron Walker right now. He is live in Australia. Cameron Walker, can you hear us?
Good evening. Yes, hopefully you can hear me. I'll keep talking till you tell me you can't. Yep. But this is the Australian Air Force plane that had picked up the royal couple from Singapore airport earlier on this morning. The King and Queen have landed in Sydney. It is a historic visit, the first time, of course, that King Charles has visited Australia as head of state. He's also going to be, when his feet stand on that tarmac, going to be the first ever reigning king to step foot on Australian soil. His mother was the first monarch to step foot on Australian soil. He, of course, is the first king. It's a very wet arrival, I'm afraid, for His Majesty the King. He seems to have brought the British weather with him. The Sydney Opera House behind me was also meant to be lit up with pictures of King Charles's 15 previous official visits to Australia, but that has not happened as of yet. We don't have any details as to why. Perhaps it's the weather, perhaps they're worried to block it, but we can just see, if you're watching on television now, the steps leading up to that Australian Air Force aircraft. When the King and Queen disembark, they're going to be greeted by the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, Her Excellency the Honourable Miss Sam Mostyn, and her husband, His Excellency Mr Simeon Beckett, who you can see in that lineup there. It looks like it's not raining at the moment, so hopefully they are going to stay dry. But clearly this is very formal. This is a very formal welcome for the King and Queen here in Sydney this evening. It's all going to be very much prepared. It's been in the planning for months, this tour. Of course, there was a huge question mark whether if it was going to happen at all because of the King's cancer diagnosis, and the King's doctors have allowed him to pause his cancer abroad here in Australia for the 9-day visit, or 6-day visit, I should say, for Australia. He's going to be visiting Sydney, Canberra, but tomorrow this is going to be the only glimpse we're going to get of King Charles tonight, other than a very informal cup of tea, I'm told, with the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. And that's only going to be a still image, we believe. So these live pictures are going to... You can just see Anthony Albanese there, actually, the Australian Prime Minister, walking across the tarmac towards the Australian aircraft. But it's going to be a very brief engagement for the King here this evening. And then we're not going to see him again until Sunday, we don't think, because of his cancer diagnosis, he's having a whole day to rest and recuperate, because of course he's been on the plane for pretty much 24 hours now. He was spotted at Heathrow Airport yesterday, boarding a commercial flight actually from Heathrow to Singapore, and it's there where, according to the Sun newspaper, he met up with the Queen, who was on a private holiday really to this part of the world, and they therefore both got on this Australian Air Force plane this morning and has now landed in Sydney. So the King and Queen will just be preparing to disembark. Also, people in that lineup you can see, as I said, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the Governor-General of Australia, and her husband. We're also expecting Her Excellency the Honourable Margaret Beazley. She is the Governor of New South Wales, which is of course where Sydney is, and we are expecting some others, the Deputy Secretary and some other politicians in this lineup.
Well, so it's going to be very interesting to see how... The last thing you need when you get off the plane is like a load of a film crew watching you disembark. Because, you know, I always feel a bit rough having travelled. I mean, they've been travelling all day. But in the studio, Nikki Hodgson and also Emma Trimble are also joining us. Nikki, I mean, seriously, there's a lot of focus on them, but you wouldn't want to get out of the plane, everyone's sort of all eyes on you.
Absolutely not. I do that journey regularly, by the way, because my family live in Australia, and the last thing you want to do is be seen by anyone apart from the people that love you when you get off. The idea of a film crew being there would fill me with absolute dread. You just feel absolutely horrific as well.
Oh, here they are. The doors are opening. This could be the moment where we get to see them. Emma, do you feel the Australians, you know, they almost feel like they're rejecting our monarchy?
Well, they've had an ongoing debate about whether or not they should be a republic, and this trip is obviously coming in the midst of that. King Charles has already said that it's up to the people whether or not they want a republic, which is sort of de facto the case. It would be very difficult for him to resist it if they held a referendum and decided otherwise. But I don't think that there's necessarily evidence that the Australian people don't want King Charles to be their head of state. And in fact, actually, it may be the case that this trip, as it has done in other places like Canada, you know, bolsters his position as head of state, because so many people are going to be coming out to see him.
Well, do you know who's on the King's curtails in Australia? Graham Smith of Republic, which is the anti-monarchy group here in the UK. They've travelled to Australia following the King and Queen, arranging protests in Canberra and Sydney. I think this is the King's private security at the door of the plane. Are we going to go back to Cameron? No, he's not ready. So the doors are open. That's the King's private security. As Cameron said, the Australian PM Anthony Albanese is there, and Cameron's ready. Let's throw to Cameron on the ground.
Here he is.
That's the King Charles.
Well, of course, the King and Queen have not quite yet disembarked the Australian Air Force flights, but I do suspect that it is very imminent indeed. And here are the King and Queen arriving on Australian soil. For the first time, reigning monarch has stepped foot on Australian soil in 11. King Charles visited a few years ago, but then, of course, he was Prince Charles, and perhaps this tour is a bit of an echo of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II's first visit to Australia as Queen way back in 1954, because it was a year after her coronation that she visited the realm, and it is a year after King Charles's coronation that he is visiting this realm. And it is his first visit to an overseas territory, overseas realm even, I should say, since he ascended the throne back in September 2022. Queen Camilla there with a see-through umbrella trying to keep dry. The King seems to be powering on through, not needing an umbrella. This is a historic moment for His Majesty the King. There he is, the first ever reigning king to step foot on Australian soil, greeting there the Governor-General of Australia, the Miss Sam Mostyn, and her husband, His Excellency Simeon Beckett. This is a lineup which perhaps if it was half an hour before wouldn't have happened outside, because it was absolutely chucking it down. There's Margaret Beazley there. She is the Governor of New South Wales, and there are a number of politicians, including the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, who famously has wanted to become a republic or hold a referendum on becoming a republic, but his government shelved those plans earlier this year after his government lost a separate vote on giving more political rights to the Aboriginal population here in Australia. And since then, those plans to hold a republic referendum were held. It's not a priority for Albanese's government right now, but the King will not be thinking about any of the Republican protests which are perhaps scheduled to happen over the next 6 days. His focus will very much be on his public engagements. He says in a statement in the last hour or so, while he was on a flight from Singapore, that he's incredibly excited to immerse himself in the different Australian communities here in the country. He will be meeting some Indigenous groups. He will also be meeting some Australians of the Year, some cancer experts, melanoma experts, who have done work around that field of melanoma, the most common form of cancer in Australia. And of course, the King himself has been diagnosed with cancer, an undisclosed form of cancer, but doctors have allowed him to pause his cancer treatment while he is in Australia for this historic visit. But of course, as perhaps you would expect, some details have been changed. For example, he was expected to visit New Zealand in the early stages of the planning for this trip. That is no longer happening. He is also going to be visiting Samoa after Australia for 6 days or so, and you may be able to see there a bouquet of flowers to the Queen. Now, that little boy is actually a boy from the Make-A-Wish, the charity which gives big kind of things to children who are seriously ill. So special moments for him. The King and Queen are still meeting as many of the invited dignitaries as possible on the tarmac at Sydney Airport.
All right, that's Cameron Walker. He's live there. Apologies for some of that flash photography, but there you have it. It's a live. The King and Queen arriving in Australia. Emma, very quickly to you.
On that point about the Republic that we were discussing earlier, and you mentioned these Republican activists who are going out there to sort of trail King Charles around Australia. We've just seen the story breaking that 100 or so Labour activists or former Labour staffers have gone out to America to campaign for Kamala Harris's campaign, which strikes me as election interference. And I actually think that, as King Charles said, which I think is a very respectful position as monarch, that it's up to the people of Australia to decide whether you agree with that or not. It's at least a respectful position. But to go out to somebody else's country and to try and interfere with what may be a referendum on something as fundamental as a constitutional point.
Somebody's just tweeted me now, because we mentioned it previously. Ruth Cadbury, who's the Labour MP for Brentford and Isleworth, she's the chair of the Transport Committee in Parliament. She is on the ground now in America, parading Harris Waltz placards, knocking doors. She said on her Facebook or Twitter, "What does one do after the Labour Party conference? I've taken myself to do a bit of work to stop Trump winning." Door knocking yesterday with the Harris Waltz team in swing state New Hampshire, along with Senate candidate Wayne Horbner, blah, blah, blah. This is outrageous. Elon Musk tweeted about it this morning, saying this is illegal and election interfering.
But who's paying for these people to get on this plane? I'm wondering, are the Labour Party paying for it?
Is it taxpayer money?
Is it taxpayer money? That's the question.
I mean, the interesting thing about the Australia question is that they themselves don't seem to be too bothered about it.
No.
And also, they won't want to give up their extra public holidays, because did you know they get more than we do? They get a holiday for the King's birthday. They definitely won't want to give up that.
Yeah, so you think that the rule... Yeah, but overall, I mean, do you feel that there should be a call for maybe getting rid of the King of Head of State there in Australia?
I mean, I think most people don't really care that much because they don't have that much reverence for him. But it should be referendum. Of course it should. That's process.
But
that's due process.
They've had one already. I mean, is it just referendums until you get the answer that you want?
Well, that's what
sometimes.
I mean, that's what they keep doing with trying to bring in a rule to say that Aboriginal people are the first people. You know, that will keep going because people are so sensitive about it. But I think with the monarchy, it's completely different. They just don't care enough.
Charles and Camilla will attend a barbecue next week. It says here a staple of Australian culture. Who knew that? And they'll also spend time in the capital, Canberra, meeting leading figures and paying their respects to the country's fallen. And Charles will meet college professor Georgina Long, who was named as Australia's Person of the Year 2024 in recognition of the pivotal work on melanoma, skin cancer.
It's desperate times when you're actually talking about somebody going to a barbecue and that becomes news. But they are the royal family.
I hope he's got some floral shirts with him.
Thank you very much, Nikki Hodgson, and also Emma Trimble.